Welcome to this podcast on the Lord's Prayer. I hope you all don't mind, but before beginning, I'd like to just take a moment to pray. Our Father, which art in heaven.
Yes?
Whoever that is, please don't interrupt me. I'm praying.
But son, you called me.
No, I didn't call you. I'm praying. Our Father, which art in heaven.
There, you did it again.
Did what?
You called me. You said, Our Father, which art in heaven. Well, here I am. What's on your mind?
But I didn't mean anything. I was just, saying my prayers for the day.
Well, all right, go on.
Okay. Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will.
Whoa, hold it right there. What did you mean by that?
It means, well, I don't know what it means. It's just part of the prayer. That's the first part of an email that was forwarded to me. And I found it so helpful because so many times I catch myself just saying, instead of praying, the words of the Lord's Prayer, or saying them without really thinking about what they mean. In this podcast, we're going to explore what the Lord's Prayer may have meant to the Jewish audience in Jesus' time, and also what it means to us today. The Lord's Prayer is found in both Matthew 6 and Luke 11. We're going to focus on Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer, which is found at the heart of the Sermon on the Mount, the greatest hits collection of Jesus' teachings. First, let's take a look at the verses leading up to the Lord's Prayer, where Jesus says that the purpose of charity and prayer is definitely not to show off. In Matthew 6, he says, "When you pray, don't be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and at the street corners, so that they may be seen by others." The Jewish custom was to pray the 18 benedictions 3 times a day, which Orthodox Jews still do today. The 18 benedictions, or blessings, are a prayer that's actually 10 times longer than the Lord's Prayer, making the Lord's Prayer short and sweet compared to the prayers of its day. The hypocrites Jesus is talking about in this verse are probably people who would plan their entire day so that they'd be at the busiest intersections of streets, at the most public places during the times of prayer, so that everyone could see them praying. The Greek word for hypocrite is also the word for actor. So Jesus is basically saying, don't turn prayer into a public performance. And the end of the Lord's Prayer reminds us the purpose of prayer is not to glorify ourselves, but to glorify God. Thine is the glory forever. The Message translation captures the spirit of these verses. It says, when you come before God, don't turn that into a theatrical production. All these people making a regular show out of their prayers, hoping for stardom. Do you think that God sits in a box seat? In other words, prayer is not an American Idol audition. So instead of performing prayer on center stage, Jesus tells us in verse 6 to pray in a closet. The Greek word that's translated as closet actually means a storeroom that's private, since back in Jesus' day, it's the only room in the house that had a door. An example I heard about the Voyager spacecraft actually helped me understand the importance of closing the door on distractions when we're communicating with God. Here it is. The transmitter power of the Voyager spacecraft is only 20 watts, which is about the power of a refrigerator light bulb. But since NASA knows exactly what frequency Voyager is on, even though it's over 6 billion miles away, NASA can hear the transmission from the Voyager by zeroing in on its frequency and blocking out all those other signals that don't match the voice of the Voyager. And that's kind of like what we have to do to get ready to pray. We have to block out all those distractions, all the static of our busy days. Turn off the TV, the iPod, the computer, and tune in to the still small voice of God that's always communicating to us. But besides being the only room in a house with a door, the storeroom is also the place where supplies are kept. Where the disciples kept their fish sticks and Diet Coke. Someone once said, in our first step of prayer, do we actually go mentally into the place where our supplies already are? In prayer, we are in the presence of the solution. How cool is that? Entering this spiritual storeroom is discovering that our needs are already met, because we're actually in the presence of God's infinite supply. As Mary Baker Eddy writes in Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, "Shall we plead for more at the open fount, which is pouring forth more than we accept?" So instead of just talking at God, we can listen to God. Instead of a monologue, prayer should be a dialogue. An email I received put it this way: prayer, don't give God instructions, just report for duty. Most people want to serve God, but only in an advisory capacity. That's the end of the email. Jesus' illustrations, on the other hand, suggest that prayer isn't about advising God. Instead, it's listening to God, the ultimate advisor. Prayer is not using God. It's letting God use us. So Jesus says in verse 7, when you're praying, don't heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they're going to be heard because of their many words. He's probably talking about Gentiles who would repeat the names of many gods, hoping that in the process they would say the name of the true God and get what they wanted, since they believed that knowing and saying the name of a god actually gave them power to manipulate that god. But Jesus says, hey, there's no need to do that, because God isn't some distant figure off in the clouds. God's your father, your daddy, your mommy, who cares about you. And God's even quicker than instant messaging, since God already knows what you need before you even type the message. So prayer doesn't have to be long-winded. It can be short, sincere, straightforward, as the Lord's Prayer itself shows. Instead of manipulating God's name, Jesus prays, "Hallowed be thy name." And instead of trying to get God to do our will, Jesus prays, "Thy will be done." Now it's time to explore the Lord's Prayer itself, which Mary Baker Eddy describes in Science and Health as the prayer which covers all human needs. Think about that, the prayer that covers all human needs. As we're going through this prayer, think about what it teaches us about how to pray. Look for the ways it speaks to the needs that you have today and to the needs of the world. A list of the sources I used when preparing these podcasts can be found on tmcyouth.com.
This podcast is produced and copyrighted by the First Church of Christ Scientists in Boston.